mode here. Okay, welcome back, everybody. And if you emailed me a question, you could ask now. I'm having some trouble with my CNU email, and I'm going to need some time to get that fixed, so it may or may not happen today. Were there any questions about any of the previous PowerPoints? Okay, well, if not, this PowerPoint's a little bit shorter than the last two, so you should have plenty of time to ask questions either as we go along or at the end. So today we're going to cover a little bit about soil itself very briefly, a little bit briefly about nutrient cycling, and then a little bit about trophic levels, food chains, and food webs, and how the grazing and detritus food webs are connected, and I will define those for you. And then we have probably touched already on all of these organisms, so I'll go through that last part fairly quickly. And then if we have time, I have a couple of little quiz games for you. And at the end, you can either unmute, or if Galen would unmute you, or you can type if you're a fast typist, which I'm not, because it's a Q&A type thing. Okay, so first of all, what is soil? There are a lot of things in soil that we don't normally think about. So the minerals are in the rocks, of course, and they are inorganic, meaning they didn't come from living things. But living organisms are considered to be part of the soil, as is any decaying organic matter. And up at the top, if you can see that, it says detritus is dead plants, dead animals, and feces on top of the soil. Detritus is a term that's used when you can tell the origin of the substance. So it isn't decomposed so much that it's still organic matter, but you can't tell what it is, as opposed to humus, which is organic material that you can chemically analyze, but you can't see what it came from, whether it's plant, animal, or what. There are gases in the soil. These are the major gases in the soil. And of course, there's water in the soil. And notice that the O2 gas is also air, which is very important to plant roots. Now, what is shown here is called a soil profile. If you're a master gardener, you probably know this already, or you may know it anyway. And the horizons are the layers. And notice that any detritus on the top, which I tend to call leaf litter, and the humus layer that doesn't really have any minerals in it is called the O layer. And then as you go down, you still have a lot of organic material with some mineral material, and that's called topsoil. And these are generalized inches here because there's a lot of different kinds of soil, and these horizons differ in each kind of soil. And then there's a layer where things are coming in. Clay is coming down from above. This is the subsoil. And then down here you have what's all mineral material, which is weathered rocks, and down here the bedrock or parent material that has not been changed at all. And this will differ if, of course, you have a soil that has developed from something that was, say, brought down from a river. So you don't start out with solid rock. You may start out with stream pebbles or whatever. But the important part of this for gardeners, of course, is the organic material in the topsoil and this O layer here. So in really good farming soil, these layers are very deep. And in infertile soil, these layers are smaller. Okay, so what does soil do naturally, and therefore what does it do for us? You probably know this already. It filters and purifies water supplies. It recycles raw materials with some help from the soil organisms, which are really part of the soil anyway. It is a habitat for those organisms that help fertilize and aerate the soil. We'll talk about ants in this connection later. And of course, it is the medium or the support that we put our plants in and that our engineers put our buildings on, etc. So soil has a lot of different functions for people. Now, you've heard of essential nutrients, macronutrients, and micronutrients. And this diagram originally just talked about elements, basically, being nutrients. But as you know, they're in combined forms in molecules. So carbon dioxide plants usually get from the air. They get oxygen from the air and from the soil, because the roots don't get it from the air, they get it from the soil. They can get gaseous nitrogen from the atmosphere, but we'll talk about the fact that plants can't use N2. It has to be chemically transformed before they can use it. And of course, then there is nitrogen in the soil. And of course, there is water vapor in the air as well as water in the soil. Okay, so what does your compost or organic matter, that's what you're adding, do for your gardens? It includes not only the chemical, but also the physical and the biological functions of soil. So when you add compost, you're not just helping your plants, you're helping the soil food web as a whole. So organic matter adds the soil structure. I tend to call this a loft. If you've ever experienced a trail, you know that when people continually, or sheep or deer or whatever, when they continually walk in the same area, the soil becomes very compacted, and it's very hard for plants to grow there. And you usually don't have to worry about mowing or cutting down things from the trail, because it's so compacted that seeds won't germinate, or if they do, they won't be able to grow. You improve the water holding capacity. The organic material in the soil is like a sponge that releases water, not like a clay layer that doesn't allow it to get through. Mineralization is changing organic material to inorganic forms. So this is part of the chemical reactions that puts the organic material into a form that plants can use. Improves the biological activity, because a lot of the small soil organisms eat dead organic material directly. And improves water and air filtration. And all of these things are interconnected. Okay, now I'm not going to go over these recycling diagrams in a lot of detail, but note that our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen gas, little bit of oxygen, and then 1%, according to this particular, I added this, but anyway, 1% is all of the other gases that might be up there, including pollutants. So one of the things that I definitely want you to remember, if you didn't already know it, is that although the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, plants cannot use nitrogen gas. Bacteria, which are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, in root nodules in legumes, peas, beans, etc., or in the soil, are the ones that are able to use this nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and put it into a form that plants can use. Okay, so that's the main thing to get out of this. Yes, lightning does put a little bit of nitrogen gas into a form that plants can use, but it is really not very important compared to the bacteria. And I would like at this point to put in a plug again for no pesticides of any kind, not just insecticides, but also herbicides, fungicides, because you don't know what they're doing. I have not really looked at the peer review literature, but all of these poisons are not doing these nitrogen fixing bacteria any good. It may not affect them much. It may affect them a whole bunch. I can't tell you, but it's certainly not food for them. Okay, carbon, you hear a lot about carbon. Carbon as an element, just C, doesn't really occur that much, certainly not in the air or even in the soil. Now, coal, which is a fossil fuel, is primarily pure carbon. There are impurities in there. But carbon the way we talk about it, it sounds like it's just carbon, but we're really talking more about carbon dioxide. So when we talk about climate change, putting carbon into the atmosphere, it's carbon dioxide that we're putting up there. Carbon dioxide is very important for plants because it is what they take in addition to sunlight in photosynthesis. And then they build this relatively simple molecule, and we're not going to go into the chemistry of it, but they build that into plant tissues, organic material. Okay, so they're adding hydrogen basically to carbon and oxygen and some nitrogen, blah, 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 to make plant tissue. And then we'll go through food chains and food webs a little bit later. But all of the compounds, all of the nutrients that plants need go through cycles. Some of them do not have an atmospheric component. Okay, sulfur, no, not sulfur. What's the one I'm trying to think of? Phosphorus, for example, which is a plant nutrient, does not go through the atmosphere. Its cycle is completely down here in the soil, plants and animals. But at any rate, things move around, and we can greatly change these natural cycles by human activities. And global climate change is the typical example of that. Okay, so let's bring in the soil arthropods to this nutrient cycling. I was very happy to find this diagram because it explains basically, if you look at it in detail, why insects are not decomposers. Now, a lot of people, anything that breaks down dead material, they call it a decomposer. What I call a decomposer is something that is putting organic material into the form that plants can use, which is inorganic. Okay, so what do these small soil arthropods do? These are two different kinds of springtails here, but of course there are others. They are basically fragmenting particles, usually dead material. Okay, most of these guys are not herbivores, so they're good in your garden. They are breaking things down, and there's a principle in science called the surface area to volume principle, which means that the smaller the piece of something is, the bigger its surface area is to its inner part. And that means that there's more surface area available for the soil microbes to act on for these chemical reactions that change this inorganic dead material into those forms that you saw in the nitrogen diagram, for example, that plants can use. So it's really chemical degradation by microbes, bacteria, and fungi. Those are the true decomposers. I added this to the diagram. So by the time the bacteria are done feeding, what you have left is inorganic material, nitrogen. This is ammonium, which is also used in addition to nitrates by plants. So true decomposers versus fragmenters. The arthropods are just the first step on the road to this cycle, putting material into the form that plants can use. You still have to add compost, the decomposing organic material, for the whole process to work. But the plants aren't using it directly. It has to be fragmented and chemically changed before the plants can suck it back up and use it. Okay, so ecologists call feeding levels trophic levels. Basically, you have the green plants down here that make their own food, make plant tissue from carbon dioxide and water and sunshine for energy. You have the herbivores that eat the autotrophs, the carnivores that eat the herbivores. In the Arctic, food chains, and this is a chain, always starting really with the sun, which I had to add to this diagram, but a chain is a very simple diagram of who's being eaten by whom. And in the Arctic, you don't have probably several levels of carnivores because the ecosystem won't support that many carnivores. It doesn't have enough autotrophs to support very many at all. And in the tropics, you probably have 3 or 4 levels, and also in the oceans in many areas. So if you think of what we tend to call the top carnivores, they are the animals that aren't eaten by anything else, and they may actually be at the first level here of carnivores or higher up, depending upon the particular ecosystem. But remember that this is called a grazing food chain. The grazing food chain is based on green plants on land and algae, which also are photosynthetic in the water. The herbivores eat the plants or the water, and then the carnivores eat them. And then I don't know if kit foxes eat scorpions, but at any rate, you get the idea that you can have a carnivore that is eaten by another carnivore. Okay. So now what is this detritus food web? This is a really complex diagram, but if you look first at the brown arrows, you're seeing anything that dies going down to the soil. So all the brown arrows go down to the brown box, which is the soil. The black arrows represent energy flow. That's what you just saw in a simple food chain. So if this, I don't know, red squirrel, I guess, or this mouse or this sparrow eat grass or seeds, the energy is going from plant material, they're making it into animal material, and then they're getting eaten by the carnivores. However, you see arrows going every which way in this. It's not a simple chain. So a food web is all the food chains in the ecosystem together. It ends up looking, I like to picture it as a fisherman's web. Things are just going every which way. Okay, so we're going to talk more about this detritus food web, but remember that detritus is dead organic material. So a shed snake skin could be detritus. Any dead plant parts could be detritus. Fecal material could be detritus, dead carcasses. Any living thing that dies, any dead organic material is detritus, without separating it into litter versus humus, depending on the degree of decomposition of that material. So this is called a detritus food web, and you see that what's coming into the food web is all dead. So the detritus is the basis rather than the green plants, which are the basis of the grazing food web. And therefore, the detritus food web depends upon the grazing food web, because it's all of these organisms that form the detritus that run the soil food web. So the detritus food web is in the soil and at the soil surface. Okay, so here's a diagram showing pretty much all the categories, except for maybe the arthropods, all the categories of organisms in the detritus or soil food web. And I've added a few things. So the organic debris is technically called detritus. Here you have leaves and carcasses, etc. There are some things in this diagram that are not arthropods. So here are your primary decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi, and the actinomycetes are just a different kind of bacteria. But you also see some worms of various kinds in here, and you see some mollusks. Okay, so we haven't talked about those because they're not arthropods, but they are all parts of the soil food web. Remember, either below the soil or at the soil surface in that O or organic layer. But look at all the different kinds of arthropods that take part in the soil food web. Here's a sow bug or a pill bug, millipedes and centipedes up here. Insects, here's a fly, a rove beetle. I'll show you photos again. Ants, mites, lots and lots of mites, and they feed at different levels. Pseudoscorpions and other arachnids are all predators, except for a few mites. So anytime you see a spider, a pseudoscorpion, a scorpion, they're all predators. Ground beetles are predators. But remember that there are so many insects that they occur at the herbivore, the carnivore levels. And also then you have organisms called omnivores that feed from both the green plants and the other animal layers. So, and we'll talk more about springtails as well. So this is very complicated. And what I'm going to start talking about now then is these different organisms. We've talked a little bit about them. Some of this will be a repeat, some of it may be new. Before we talk about the specific organisms, I wanted to give you something about the size of these organisms. So microflora and microfauna are the tiniest things. Don't look at the pictures, look at the dark bars. Okay, so these guys are in the micrometer area, because you have to have 1,000 of those micrometers to be 1 millimeter. So over here, you finally get to millimeters, and there aren't very many organisms that fall into the millimeter category, let alone anything that's an inch or more. So you're looking at 25.4 millimeters to be an inch, and that's going to be right down here. So yeah, there are some mollusks, spiders, beetles, earthworms, of course, millipedes, centipedes. I don't know what they're talking about amphipods here. I don't know of any amphipods in the soil. And actually, they've got this backwards anyway. This is an amphipod. This is an isopod. So the sow bugs and pill bugs are isopods. All their legs look alike. Okay, and the harvestmen, pseudoscorpions, remember I showed you were pretty small, so none of them get up to an inch in length. Pseudocentipedes are garden centipedes, and again, don't look at the picture, look at where the bar is. So some of these tiny things we won't talk about in here. I can't see the top of the slide right now. This is megafauna. I think one of these is meso, and I can't remember the other category, but it relates to how big they are. So a lot of things in the soil, and I'm going to show you some soil samples in your quiz at the end today. But you have to use screens to sift things out, to get the rocks and other larger mineral particles out in order to be able to see many of these things, even under a microscope. Okay, so remember that centipedes and millipedes fall into different trophic levels. Your centipedes are all predators, and remember the way to tell them is they're flattened. They have relatively long appendages. They do have long antennae as well as these structures sticking out. I can't remember if they're called cerci, and I can't tell which end is which on this. It looks like that should be the head, but I think this is the poisoned claw right here. So I think this is actually the head, and the antenna you're not seeing. And these guys move very fast, which is usually a characteristic of most predators. Millipedes, on the other hand, are either scavengers, meaning they're eating dead material, it doesn't run away from them, or they can sometimes, if they're in very large numbers, eat some plant parts. But I think on the whole, you have to consider them beneficial arthropods in your garden. Remember, they are rounded. They appear to have 2 pairs of legs per segment, and you can see waves of motion when they're moving, and they don't go very fast. Kind of like watching a slow freight train go by a crossing. And then there are these guys that are also myriapods, lots of legs. You can clearly see they're arthropods by their segmentation. They don't have any eyes. They're usually unpigmented. I think this coloration here is probably from something it ate. Here's the size. They consume decaying vegetation. They can live deep in the soil, or they can be closer to the surface under rocks, decaying wood, etc. And they can eat some plant parts, but normally they're eating them as they're decaying, not from the living plant. And remember, these guys are very small. So if you see something kind of looks like this, it may be a regular old centipede rather than one of these guys. Okay, another complicated diagram. The whole point of this is 2 things. Soil mites are very abundant. They are one of the most abundant soil arthropods. And again, they occur at different trophic levels. So there are, as we talked about earlier, there are predaceous soil mites. There are some that feed on microbes. And technically, these are put into the herbivore group unless you want to call them scavengers or saprophotes. Saprophobe means saprophyte, excuse me. No, saprophobe. Sapro means decaying. And I'm zoning out on the last part of the word to mean feed on it. But they do eat the bacteria and the fungi that are eating the dead organic material. Okay, and then of course there are some bad guys in the soil, as there are up above the soil, that actually eat on plant parts. So there are all kinds of mites. And I think I have another diagram. Yeah, here's your ecological roles: eat decaying organic material and the microorganisms, fungi, algae, and bacteria. Predators, they also eat roundworms. There are a ton of tiny, tiny, tiny roundworms, not parasitic. These are free living. Most people think that the number of nematode species that have been named are only a small portion of the ones that exist. I mean, unless you're an expert, nematodes all look alike if they're the same size. And here's something that is worth pointing out, that these orbatid mice disperse spores of mycorrhizal fungi. And as you probably know, these mycorrhizal fungi aid plants in uptake of some of their nutrients, which is a mutualism. So these guys are very definitely beneficial in the garden. And most orbatids look armored. They look like they have a plate on the top. And all of these guys are orbatids. This one is really atypical. And I think there's a couple of these in one of the slides that I'm going to show you at the very end. But look at all the different kinds and sizes of these mites, but they're all very tiny. But the orbatids are beneficial in many ways. Here's a predatory soil mite. They seem to have a larger front end rostrum. The better to stick their mouth parts into smaller or even larger arthropods in the soil. Okay, Pseudoscorpions. I showed you how tiny these were at one point in time. You see the chelate or pincher-like pedipalps. They still have 4 pairs of legs. Those are not legs. And they can hold on to the small soil organisms that they eat. And remember that none of them get up to an inch long. They are quite small. Some of them very tiny. And again, I'll show you them later. Now, these particular daddy longlegs, I think I have not showed you before. These are called the armored harvestmen. And some of these are found in this litter layer, if not further down. Okay, this is the daddy longlegs are not really a group that you see a lot of in the soil if you're down below this organic layer. They are mostly predators, but they can also be scavengers, which is what they're doing in the detritus food chain. The armored harvestmen have relatively short legs for a daddy longleg, and they're frequently armored and spiny, which is how they get their name. And that is probably an anti-predator move. Now, I've shown you some pretty ground spiders, and these guys are pretty much on the ground, although you can find this parson spider in cabins a lot. But these guys would be more in the litter. But when you get down into the soil, you find a lot of little tiny spiders. Okay, so again, these are all predators. They're, I won't call them top predators, but they're definitely carnivores in the food chain. And you've seen this slide before, I think. These are proturans. They're the things that always used to be called primitive insects. and now they're sometimes just called hexapods. This is the order within class Insecta. And you see they do have 6 legs and they do have segmentation, but they have no eyes, no antennae, no wings at any stage. And they are these are quite small. I don't think I've ever even seen one of these in a soil sample, unless I just missed it. And they may suck out the contents of the fungal hyphae, which is the main filamentous body of fungi. So again, beneficial fragmenters, not true decomposers, but they're in that soil food web. Okay, diplurans, 2 families, the Campodiids with the 2 long tails and the Gepigids with what looks like earwig pinchers at the end, but these guys don't really look anything like earwigs, and you're not going to find them above the surface. Most of these quote unquote primitive insects don't have any color. This guy seems to have a little bit of sclerotization. They lose water very easily, and so you only find them in moist places down in the soil. You don't normally see these running around on the surface like you might see an earwig, for example, which are also much larger. Some of them are omnivores. Some in this group in particular are predators. But I think all of them are probably beneficial in your garden, although you may never see them. They're in the soil food web. They're important there. I've showed you springtails before. Here are the water ones on top of the water. Here's my favorite bumpy one. And here's one I hadn't showed you. So there are several different families of springtails that don't really look a whole lot alike. And some of them don't even have the spring tail, but they're all in the same group. They do have eyes, they do have antennae, but they never have any wings. And they also carry the spores of these mycorrhizal fungi and helper bacteria. So they're furry enough. This one has hair here, this one you can't see, to carry spores around, and that does help. And it says they may help control plant fungal diseases by eating them or their spores. Okay, so again, along with the mites, these are probably the most abundant soil arthropods. Here's one that shows the tail in the sprung position. So that one jumped before he died. Often less than 2 millimeters long, not very big, but you can see them on snow or on the top of the water if you're looking carefully. They are very soft, again, usually unpigmented. Anything that's pale and white usually doesn't have a hard exoskeleton or cuticle. So any insect after it's just molted is going to be white and soft. They're very vulnerable at that stage until the chemical reactions of molting have taken place and cross-linked the proteins and other things in the cuticle and deposited the pigment, which makes them more resistant. So these guys are omnivorous. They're going to eat dead plant and dead animal material, fungi, etc. If they're carnivorous, they're eating these tiny little things. Rotifers are multicellular aquatic organisms that occur in the soil water, but they're smaller than they're smaller than some protozoans. So they're very small. And if any of these guys are predators, they're eating very, very small things in the soil. Okay, now, if you are a master gardener, you know all about black soldier flies. Here's the life cycle: egg, larva, molting into a bigger larva, molting into a bigger larva. And I think these are supposed to be pupae here. Pupae differ from larvae in that they do not move around and feed. The pupae of some Lepidoptera, at any rate, can move the abdomen. Actually, mealworms, the pupal stage can move its abdomen. I think it's an anti-predator mechanism, but they do not feed. And what's happening inside the pupa, and in some cases inside the cocoon or whatever, is that the tissues are completely being rearranged from the larva to the adult. So that's taking a lot of energy. So very frequently in insects, the larva ends up being bigger than the adult. If you think of the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm, the butterfly is pretty big, or moth. Yeah, I think that one's a moth, isn't it? It's pretty big, but it's not nearly as big as the larva. And that's because that tissue serves as energy, is broken down in this rearrangement of tissues to go from something that looks like a worm to an insect with wings. Now, here is an adult photo of an adult. Notice the kind of body shape, the coloration, the white feet, basically. And then here is an example of a mud dauber wasp. I couldn't find two that actually matched better than this. I was trying not to use Australian ones or whatever. But it's really kind of amazing. Once I realized that these guys were mimics of mud daubers, they move the same. So there are some spiders that mimic ants. And one of the things that makes it so difficult to tell them apart is they move like an ant, not like a spider. And these black soldier fly adults will move in the same fashion as a mud dauber wasp. So it can really be pretty hard to tell them apart. Now, these guys are used in composting because they're good fragmenters in the larval stage. Of course, the adults aren't really doing anything other than bringing you a next generation of larvae to help fragment in there. Okay, so this side is a little bit off the topic, but I wanted to point out that these white
I brought you a
grubs,
couple of tomatoes.
uh-oh.
Are you sad about father's son? You're good.
I have quite a few of these in my yard, and I'm not sure what they are. I have had the smallest one here is the Japanese beetle. This is the European chafer beetle, which is an invasive species from Europe. And then here is the June beetle, what they call a June beetle down here. Back up in Illinois, there was a little brown scarab that we call the June beetles, probably because of the seasonality differs because of the climate. But at any rate, then these guys will eat plant roots. So these are not good guys. And everybody knows that the adult Japanese beetles will eat your roses and other plants. And I'm sure these guys are doing exactly the same thing. I wanted to show you this particular picture of a June beetle for two reasons. The antenna here, the antennae are, I think they're called lamellate in ento parlance. And that means they have layers that they can open. And of course, they have sensory cells. And so they're really sensing chemically their surroundings. But the other thing I wanted to show you, if you've ever experienced trying to hand pick a Japanese beetle off, or if you've watched a wasp or something, they have this nifty defense mechanism of putting their back legs up over their backs to try to repel a predator. And this picture shows this pretty well, where it's holding its legs up. As far as I know, these guys don't do that. These guys are really funny. When I first came down here, I remember walking at Hampton University one day from class to class, and these guys fly so slowly that they literally fly right into you, or you walk into them. They're not able to change direction and get out from in front of you if you're just walking at a normal pace. So these are all scarab beetles. Dung beetles are in a different group within the family Carabidae, within the order Coleoptera or beetles. And one of the ways that you can tell them is by those lamellate antennae. And they're frequently big, heavy beetles, hard to put on a pin if you're an entomologist. Another kind of beetle, which is predaceous, which is important in soil and litter food webs, are the Staphylinidae or the Rove beetles. And again, I think I showed you this larva before with the big jaws. And here you see the big jaws on this adult. You can't really see it on this one, but I wanted to be sure and show you a couple of different colors because they're not all colored like this, although this one is one of the common ones. The way to tell a Rove beetle is this elongate shape. and truncated wing covers. I couldn't find a really good photo for you of one that had the wing covers spread and then the hind wings unfolded. So all beetles take their front wings and they just hold them to the side. They unfold the back wings and that's what they use to fly. And in those June beetles, they fly slowly enough you can actually see that. You can see them holding their wing covers, but the truncated or cut off looking wing covers is a good way to tell, even if they don't look like this. And some of these can be very tiny in the soil. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of ground beetles. So I picked up this picture off the web for you just to show you that they're not all black, but this is a very typical looking ground beetle here. And they have pretty big jaws, not quite as big as the tiger beetles, but they're very effective predators. This is a big jawed one here. And you'll find a lot of them on the ground surface. You know, if you just kick a bunch of leaves, you'll find them under the leaves, and there are smaller ones in the soil as well, and particularly the larvae. And again, look at the jaws. So whenever you see something that looks like a worm but has 6 legs, you know it's some kind of an insect larva. And if it has big jaws like this, you know that it is a predator and it is beneficial and you should not squash it. Okay. Here's something that I learned when I was teaching this class, Ecosystem Services of Insects for CNU, is about these, you as master gardeners, you may have known about these. These things here on the seed are called elaiosomes. Here's the spelling, which I can never get right. And the ants are attracted to them and they will eat the elaiosome, but not the seed. The only ones that I'm aware of that eat seeds are harvester ants. They're very common in the desert. They have a nasty sting. They are found in Virginia, but they're not as common as other ants. So these guys actually eat things like grass seeds, probably not these big fat ones. But in addition to taking these seeds down into their nest and not eating them, they're eating just the elaiosome, which is an adaptation of the plant to get its seed moved down where it's away from a bird that might eat it, and then it'll sprout out of the ant nest or around the ant nest if they throw it out after they eat the elaiosome. And so that's a benefit to the plant because it's basically, if it's in the ant nest, it's protected from seed predators like birds. And in making their tunnels and nests, they turn the soil and they aerate it. So they're moving organic material and mineral material around in the soil, and they're also allowing more oxygen to reach plant roots. So ants are good in soil. Okay, I'm doing really good today. Here is one of your quizzes. Let you look at this for a minute while I look at what is in the chat, the questions that might be in the chat here. I don't think that's what I wanted. Here we go. What are, cicadas, C-I-C-A-D-E-D-A-S. Cicadas are in the group Homoptera. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts. They eat plant juices, but the females additionally damage trees, damage small twigs in trees because they oviposit or lay their eggs in them. So we talked about the cicada killer wasps, the great big yellow and black wasps that people see around. They're almost as big as your little finger. I mean, they are pretty big around here for wasps. And they eat cicadas. They basically take them down into their nests in the ground and lay an egg on them, and the larvae eat them. So the cicadas are bad guys. The cicada killers are good guys. Anybody have any questions to this point before the quiz? Okay, let me close that out. All right, so we've been looking at these soil arthropods. Let's see how many of them you can name. Why don't you go ahead? Galen, can you unmute them, or do you want them to all post their answers?
They can do either or. I can't unmute anyone. They'd have to do it themselves, or you can drop it in the chat.
Okay, so either way, what's this? Somebody tell me what this is. Lots of legs, lots and lots of legs, kind of rounded.
It looks like a millipede.
Millipede, great. What are these white things here?
Ooh.
6 legs, no antennae. Well, no, they have antennae. 6 legs, antennae, no pigment.
Larvae.
What do you think?
Larvae.
They kind of look like larvae because they're white. And you can't see the eyes. They do have eyes, but you can't see them very well. But these are actually springtails. They're one of the families. And plus, these are from New Zealand, so you've probably never seen these particular ones. But these are, remember I said that the springtails and the mites were the most abundant soil arthropods. So let's see how many different kinds of mites we can see here.
One, yeah.
There's one there. There's one here. Look at these tiny guys here.
Gosh,
And these weird looking things.
yeah.
I thought it was a ricinuleid, but since this is from New Zealand and they don't have ricinuleids, but if you look, there are 4 legs on each side. And so that makes it an arachnid. And so this is a kind of a soil mite that they have in New Zealand. I've never seen one of these in a soil sample. Now, this guy here looks like it has claws up here. What does that make it?
Pseudoscorpion.
Pseudoscorpion, absolutely. Does anybody else see anything that we haven't named in here yet? Wow. It's hard to see how many legs that has. If it's 6, it might be, no, I think it's, this is probably another kind of mite. It doesn't look like a spider to me, and it looks like it has 8 legs. Let's move on because we have some more of these. All right, and I'm not, there we go. Here's from grassland soil in Germany. Shout out your answer. What's this?
A mite.
Mite. 1, 2, 3, 4, not pinched in the middle. What's that? Another mite.
That's
Now
right.
this one looks like it has a shell on the top. That makes it what kind of mite? Or batted. And this guy here, 6 legs and antennae. No wings, not a larva.
So a springtail. I don't.
That is a springtail. Here's another mite. That one looks like a predatory mite. What do you think these white bars are? I wish they'd labeled them, but I think these are millimeter markings. Scientists frequently put those. So actually, the smaller this is compared to the organism, the bigger the organism is, right? So these are not to scale with each other. And this is another kind of springtail, another kind of springtail, another kind of springtail. This is interesting. 6 legs and antennae makes it what? Some kind of
Springtail again?
What?
Springtail? No.
No, I think this one is actually a little beetle. It's hard to see.
Okay.
But it doesn't say springtail to me. It looks like it has too much sclerotization in the exoskeleton. This one's a springtail. That one's a springtail. What's this? 4 legs, no antennae.
A mite?
A mite, springtail, or batted mite, springtail. So most of these are either springtails or mites, which you would expect. Last one. Okay, and these came, this was really hard. This source is international, but I could not find where this collage came from. But this is a nematode worm here, a round worm, doesn't have any segments.
Yeah, roundworm.
Water bear is a tardigrade. We didn't talk about it. I
Oh,
totally left it out.
Okay.
And this one also gives you the sizes without the white bars. So there's a bunch of springtails. What is C? Potworms. Yeah, that's a kind of a worm that we didn't talk about. Here is one of those hairy springtails. So all of those are springtails. G as well, I guess. There's the antenna right there. Might. What's this guy?
That's a lot of it.
They're calling it a woodlouse, which may mean that this is actually a British collage because we don't call them that so much over here. That looks more like a pill bug, like it's going to be able to curl up, but it might be a sow bug. Now, this is only the head and thorax of a what? Ground beetle or carabid. So this is a really big guy.
Oh, okay.
And all you can see is the front end, but you see the antennae and the very hard exoskeleton or cuticle. Everybody knows what that is, right?
Earthworm.
Yeah, and then this one is a what? Compared to this.
This is a millipede,
And this is a,
centipede,
and this is a
spider.
spider. Yes. Okay, so I recommend, this is a very readable little paperback here. This is also, if you like reading nature books, this one is more, I won't say academic, but it's a little bit drier than this one. This guy, Waldbauer, he writes a lot of nature books that are pretty readable. I use this for a textbook for my ecosystem services of insects class at CNU. And then this one focuses on ecosystem services supplied by the soil. So those are some references. Were there any other questions from this presentation or going back from any of the other ones, since I'm having some trouble with my CNU email presently?
This is Deborah Mosier. I have missed 2 of your excellent Zoom programs. Has Norfolk Master Gardeners recorded this? Are they being recorded?
Yes, Galen is recording them. Where are they going? I think they're on Better Impact. Is that where they are, Galen?
No, they are on the Hampton Master Gardener website. So I'll put it in the chat box there.
Thank you.
If you scroll down towards the bottom, the links will be there.
Okay.
Thank you for your kind comment. Yeah, next time is the last one, which is kind of a summary. I think I called it sustainable gardening. It will, of course, have a focus on, I'm an ecologist with a lot of training in entomology. And so the focus of the last one will be on maintaining the ecosystem, maintaining everything in there, not just your plants. So it'll have maybe a little bit different focus than you might expect if it was just a horticulturist, for example, talking about sustainable gardening. Any other questions? Well, okay. Thank you for attending. Hope to see you next week.
And also put the website in the chat box for
Thank
people
you.
to find the recording.
Oh, wait, do I have some more? Or you put it in there?